Imagine this. You're sitting in the dark gondola of an airship somewhere above the silent Arctic ice. The engines are roaring so hard your teeth are rattling, and the cold seeps under your fur flight suit the way water creeps under ice. Just a thin skin of metal separates you from -30. And below, inside, dim lamps, exhausted faces, and people who no longer really know where day ends and night begins. They can't just go to bed. Each of them is riveted to their instrument, to the controls, to the map. And yet right here, in this noise and these drafts, they have to fall asleep, or the flight will end in disaster. Before we go on, write in the comments where you're watching this video from and what time it is for you right now. It's fun to imagine all the different points on the map where people are listening to the story of those who slept in the sky above the pole. When humanity started thinking seriously, not just about reaching the North Pole, but about flying across the entire Arctic, airships became the obvious choice. They could stay aloft for a long time and didn't need a flat runway on the ice. That's how the plan for the flight of the airship Norge was born, an Italian semi-rigid craft designed under the direction of Umberto Nobile and commanded by the famous Norwegian polar explorer Roald Amundsen. In the spring of 1926, they decided to fly from Svalbard across the North Pole to Alaska, and that meant not hours, but days of continuous time in a cold airborne vessel. Even then it was clear. The crew's sleep wasn't about comfort. It was a matter of survival and the success of the expedition. Norge looked impressive, more than 100 meters long with a lightweight metal framework, a huge volume of hydrogen inside, and underneath a gondola and an open keel that the crew used to reach the engines. The gondola was essentially a little house slung under this giant. A metal frame, skin, windows, simple partitions, and no real insulation, because every extra kilogram was in direct competition with fuel and range. Outside, icy winds scraped along the hull. Inside, the cold crept through gaps in hatches and frame joints, turning the warm spots near engines and lamps into rare islands of heat. Falling asleep there literally meant squeezing up against those islands and accepting that your hands and feet would still be freezing. During the long stages of the Arctic crossing, no one on Norge got anything like a full night's sleep. The flight stretched over dozens of hours, and people nodded off in short bursts. The navigator might close his eyes for a moment without even unbuckling his harness, resting his head on a bent arm over the chart, while his crewmate paced the narrow keel to drive the numbness out of his legs. These micro-sleeps were dangerous. The brain tried to shut down, but the body stayed in a booming, vibrating box, and any sudden movement of the airship snapped people back into reality. Little by little, fatigue turned almost tangible, thickening in that thin strip of air between the frozen outer shell and the hot engine casings. The Norge experience showed just how merciless the combination of cold, noise, and sleep deprivation could be, but this problem revealed itself in truly tragic form 2 years later, in the story of the airship Italia. Nobile's team in 1928 was also flying from Svalbard to the pole and back, making a series of polar sorties, and by the time of the fatal flight, they were worn out. Later analysis shows that the crew went into that last mission with a severe sleep deficit. To rest at least a little between flights, they lay down right in the passageway in the keel under the envelope, between the frame girders, where they could stretch out, but still felt every jolt and vibration of the whole structure. It wasn't rest so much as a short pause before the next plunge into the icy noise. The memories of Italia crew members show how hard everyday life in flight really was. In the gondola, instruments constantly rattled, panels vibrated, and the cold outside was so intense that condensation on the inner surfaces froze into a crust. The heating was weak and uneven, closer to heat sources you could take off a layer of clothing, but if you stepped toward a window or the door into the keel, the cold instantly bit through your gloves and boots. One officer recalled that when they managed to lie down in the narrow passage, they still kept their fursuits and boots on. Taking anything off meant you might not have time to warm up again if an alarm woke you. That's how a special sleep culture formed. Sleep without undressing, don't go far from your post, and always be ready to jump back to the instruments. Because of the constant noise and vibration, the airship seemed to impose its own rhythm on the crew, the exact opposite of what the body wants. Instead of quiet before sleep, the thunder of engines instead of a soft bed, a hard bench or wooden deck. People learned to fall asleep wearing headsets, with goggles and wind masks still on their faces, strapped in so that a sudden bank or turbulence wouldn't throw them off their improvised bunk. In these conditions, sleep became more like a safety procedure than rest. If you didn't sleep at all, mistakes in piloting or calculations were almost guaranteed. And if you slept too deeply, you might not wake up in time for a sudden weather change or ice forming on the controls. Researchers who studied the Italia story directly note, accumulated fatigue and disrupted sleep were among the factors that led to the crash over the ice. Against that background, the Arctic flight of the Graf Zeppelin in 1931 looks strikingly different. The German airship was already much more comfortable, but for the polar expedition, it was stripped of its usual luxury. Partitions, heavy furniture, even regular tableware were removed from the cabins to make room for scientific equipment and to lighten the structure. And instead of normal beds, they installed lightweight bunks. As a result, passengers and part of the crew slept in one large space, separated only by curtains under the never-ending drone of the engines, while the airship spent more than 130 hours in the air over the frozen ocean. In the Arctic summer, the sun barely sets, and the participants of the Graf Zeppelin polar flight wrote about how hard it was to understand when it was time to sleep at all. Outside the windows there was always a milky light, ice fields, and snowy shadows. Inside the gondola, the carousel of watches never stopped for a minute. And so the person who went off duty felt as if they'd been lifted out of the rhythm of machines and instruments, yet they still heard them in their sleep. The light bunks that replaced normal beds sometimes swayed in sync with the airship's maneuvers, and many admitted that, at first, they woke up with the feeling they were being called back to their watch or to an emergency. Sleep and work blended into one continuous background, and the only real difference between them was whether you were strapped to a bunk or to a seat at the instruments. Gradually, long-range airplanes began to replace airships in polar flights, and as the technology changed, so did the way crews slept. In the late 1930s, the Soviet AN-T-25 aircraft commanded by Valery Chkalov made a transcontinental flight over the North Pole from Moscow to the west coast of the United States, and the journey took more than 60 hours. In the cramped cockpit of this long-winged monoplane, 3 men took turns snatching short rest breaks. While one flew the aircraft, the second helped with instruments, and the third tried to sleep in a narrow space behind the seat, leaning his back against the cold fuselage skin and keeping his fur gear on. The idea of sleeping at your post simply moved from airship gondolas into the metal tubes of airplanes. Early polar aircraft had almost nothing like the cabin heating we take for granted today. Thin metal panels, small canopy windows, and countless rivets and hatches created dozens of paths for the cold to creep in. The engine did give off heat, but it pooled around the motor and only partially reached the pilot through a crude, poorly regulated system of ducts, so some parts of the cockpit overheated while others stayed deeply chilled. Studies of cockpit thermal conditions show that at high altitudes, the temperature around the pilot can easily drop below zero if the protection systems are imperfect, exactly what the crews of those early Arctic flights experienced. In such conditions, even a short sleep became both a salvation from exhaustion and a test of whether the body could handle yet another dose of cold. By the mid-1930s, polar pilots and navigators had formed their own unwritten sleep protocol. Before a long flight, they put on several layers of clothing, then a fur suit, a mask, and thick gloves, fully aware that they'd hardly take any of it off in the air. When someone went to rest, they didn't go far. They lay down on equipment crates, mail bags, or fuel containers, clipping a belt around themselves so they wouldn't fall if the plane lurched. Sometimes they rigged improvised bunks in the cockpit, spread out ponchos, shoved bags, or rolled up jackets under their heads. But of course, it was nothing like a real bed. The engine noise became both an enemy and a strange kind of lullaby for these people. The thunder of propellers and the vibration of the fuselage made it hard to fall asleep. But once the body finally gave in, that same noise turned into a background sound, familiar and even reassuring. If the engines were roaring steadily, it meant things were fine. The howl of the wind against the thin skin of the aircraft, the faint warmth from a small stove or gasoline heater, the occasional crackle of ice forming on the windows. All of this merged into a bizarre soundtrack of polar sleep, where the body was freezing, but the mind clung to a single thought: as long as morning doesn't bring a breakdown or a storm. And as they fell asleep in those icy skies, the crews knew that their personal comfort was the last thing that mattered, because thousands of kilometers of nameless pressure ridges still lay ahead. The longer polar flights became, the more clearly commanders realized: a sleep-deprived crew is more dangerous than any storm hiding behind the clouds. In reports and later studies of the Italia tragedy, it was stated outright that the crew reached the crucial stages with a severe lack of sleep, which meant slowed reactions, dulled attention, and a higher tendency to make mistakes. In the roaring gondolas and cramped cockpits, a new harsh rhythm emerged. Short watches were followed by even shorter sleep episodes, during which a person never truly managed to leave reality behind. This is how a special kind of polar sleep was born. Anxious, fragmented, but still life-saving. On airships like Norge and Graf Zeppelin, night watches dragged on for hours, and the commander arranged shifts so that no one stayed at the instruments for too long in a row. One person watched the course and navigation. Another monitored the engines and the keel. A third kept observation logs on ice and weather. And each of these tasks demanded a clear head, even if everything around was half dark and drowned in a monotonous hum. Sleep came in the gaps. Someone sat down on a narrow bench, leaned against the gondola wall, feeling the frame shudder behind their back, and switched off for a few minutes without taking off their gloves or mask. Sometimes those minutes were worth more than whole hours of sleep on the ground. Researchers who analyzed the Italia crash noted that by the time of the accident, people were in a state of accumulated many-day fatigue, and their bodies could no longer distinguish between day and night. In the conditions of the polar day, when there is constant light outside the windows, this loss became almost literal. Night was simply the hours when they allowed themselves to close their eyes. Pilots and navigators learned to fall asleep on command, the moment a chance appeared, because no one knew when the next pause would come. In effect, lack of sleep became an invisible but very real participant in many polar airship expeditions. When the center of gravity of polar flights shifted from airships to airplanes, everything changed. Altitudes grew, speeds increased, and cockpits became tighter and colder. Unlike the large gondolas where you could at least walk a bit or stretch your legs, Long-range pilots sat in one position for many hours, strapped in and surrounded by instruments. They had to look for rest literally behind the back of the main workstation, on sacks, crates, or flat patches of floor, where they could at least bend their knees without hitting the control levers. Early polar aircraft turned into a kind of flying barracks for 3 or 4 people. At the same time, the cockpits themselves had little in common with the warm, sealed spaces of modern airliners. They were thin-walled metal boxes with plenty of joints, hatches, and rivets that gave the cold air countless ways in. Even when some heating was installed, the temperature at the pilot's feet and by the sidewalls could be much lower than near the instrument panel, as studies of thermal comfort in small cockpits later confirmed. Airflows created zones where the frost quite literally got stuck, and anyone dozing off in such a spot would wake to find their feet or fingers numb, despite fur gloves. Sleep turned into a series of short attempts to warm up and rest, rather than a continuous dive into quiet. Valery Chkalov's flight in the ANT-25 over the North Pole to the United States became one of the symbols of this new airplane era of long Arctic journeys. The aircraft spent more than 2.5 days in the air, and the 3 crew members had to arrange their shift work and sleep right there in the cramped cockpit, where every shelf and crate became part of an improvised sleeping area. While one was at the controls, the second helped with instruments and radio, and the third tried to lie down behind the seats, staying in a fur suit and boots, because the temperature in the plane remained low anyway. Their rest looked less like normal sleep and more like a prolonged half-days in which the engine noise never stopped. A similar body of experience was accumulating in Soviet Arctic aviation, which in the 1930s was actively opening routes over the Arctic Ocean and building a network of polar airfields. Pilots delivering supplies to Dixon, Tixi, and the Arctic Islands often spent long hours in the air, and going back to the rear areas for rest was impossible. They had to sleep either at temporary ice bases or right in the aircraft while waiting for the weather. A cockpit warmed during the day by a running engine cooled down at night, and people lay down to sleep right in their fur gear, covering themselves with spare jackets and ponchos on top of crates and fuel drums. Scenes like this became a routine part of life for northern crews. Engineers and doctors began to pay closer attention to how pilots slept on long flights. Once it became obvious that hypothermia and sleep deprivation were directly linked to safety. Reports on polar missions described cases where, after several hours at altitude, a person could barely straighten their fingers, and if they tried to rest in the cold part of the cockpit, they fell asleep so deeply that waking them took real effort because their body temperature had already dropped to a dangerous level. In response, experiments started with more efficient heating systems, extra insulation, and better clothing setups, even though every extra kilogram of padding cut into fuel or cargo reserves. A choice between comfort and range was impossible to avoid. Usually, strict routines emerged on such flights. No one had the right to fall asleep without making sure their replacement was truly awake and ready to take over. During an Arctic flight, relying only on instruments was risky. Radio contact could fail, compasses could act up near the magnetic pole, and a tired person made mistakes far more often. That is why every sleep interval was formally cleared by the commander, and the sleeper stayed within arm's reach, literally a few steps or outstretched hands from the controls. Even in sleep, these people seemed unwilling to let the aircraft out of their grasp. The weak stoves and gasoline heaters installed in airship gondolas and aircraft cockpits often became the center of gravity during short rest breaks. Around them, crews dried frozen mittens, warmed canned food, and tried to thaw ice-encrusted boots. And in quiet moments, someone would edge a little closer and nod off for a few minutes, holding their hands out to the faint warmth. But those same heat sources were dangerous. In a confined, poorly ventilated space, there was always the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning or fire, so they had to be strictly controlled. It created a strange kind of balance between the desire to get warm and the need to avoid disaster. Over time, polar pilots and navigators developed small, almost ritual habits that helped them fall asleep in these conditions. Some always tied their laces and belts in a particular way so that, even in the dark and wearing mittens, they could jump up in seconds and get back to their station. Others, before lying down, checked that there were no sharp objects nearby that could hit their head or ribs during a sudden maneuver. And some asked their partner to wake them not just at a set time, but at the first sign of a change in engine noise or fuselage vibration, because that was how trouble most often began in flight. Even on the more comfortable Graf Zeppelin, which before the Arctic expedition was considered almost a luxury liner of the skies, the polar mission required giving up much of that comfort. Cabins were simplified, heavy furniture removed, and sleeping places made as light and functional as possible. The bunks used on the flight over the ice looked more like shipboard berths, narrow, hard, with a minimum of soft padding so as not to add weight. Anyone lying down on them had to accept that every step, every shout, every new order could be heard through the thin partitions, while outside, somewhere below, a white, silent ocean drifted past. That constant background noise turned sleep into a continuation of the watch, only with eyes closed. Gradually, documents, memoirs, and reports began to speak more and more often of the chronic fatigue and nervous strain of polar crews, even though the medical language to describe such states did not yet exist. The Italia tragedy became one of the turning points. Aviation medicine and human factors specialists, writing many years later, emphasized that sleep loss and overwork played their own, if invisible, role in the chain of events. The experience of long flights on the ANT-25 and other long-range aircraft led to a new understanding. When planning a route, one also had to plan the crew's rest, even if that rest happened right there in the frozen sky, under the howl of wind and the thunder of engines. This is how the history of sleep in the Arctic became an inseparable part of the story of conquering the pole from the air. When you look at photos from those expeditions, what jumps out first are the fur hoods, masks, bulky mittens, heavy boots. People seem turned into sluggish animals, barely recognizable under all those layers. But for the crews of the airships Norge and Italia, as well as for the pilots of the early polar planes, this wasn't a show of bravery. It was the only way to make it to the end of a shift, and at least get a little sleep in the icy roar of the engines. They knew that taking off even 1 or 2 layers for comfort almost guaranteed shivering and numbness during a short rest. And then they would have to fly on the edge of hypothermia, where every mistake becomes more likely. So their sleep always began with the weight of fur on their shoulders and the creak of frozen fabric, not with a light blanket and soft pajamas. Getting ready for sleep on these flights looked nothing like it does in everyday life. Instead of undressing, a person checked fasteners, tightened straps, adjusted mask and collar so there would be no gaps for the wind. On airships like the Graf Zeppelin, members of the polar expedition would, before lying down on their light bunks, once again inspect their fursuits, knowing they would be sleeping in the same gear they had just worn on watch at the instruments. In long-range aircraft, whether it was Chkalov's ANT-25 or Soviet Arctic aviation machines, pilots often did not even unlace their boots. Trying to warm up feet that had cooled down again could cost more effort than the rest was worth. The going-to-bed ritual turned not into shedding clothes, but into one more check of how reliable they were, and that alone set their sleep into a completely different mindset. Inside gondolas and cockpits, favorite warm spots slowly emerged, places everyone gravitated to when they got a short break. On Italia, These were areas near the stoves and those sections where heat from the engines seeped through the bulkheads, and in the keel, compartments shielded from direct drafts, but still wide enough to stretch out between the girders. On the Graf Zeppelin, members of the polar flight tried to claim the bunks and corners of the common room, where the engine noise sounded a bit more muffled, and the hull did not radiate such vicious cold. In aircraft cockpits, pilots quickly learned from experience where the wind slipped in through canopy gaps and panel joints, and tried to set up makeshift sleeping spots in those rare places where the metal did not feel like a slab of ice. Sleep began with the search for this almost invisible comfort zone that might differ by just a few degrees, yet determined whether their legs would cramp by morning. Small stoves and gasoline heaters played a special role, those unremarkable devices that reports usually mentioned only in passing, but without which many flights would have been nearly impossible. They did not produce enough heat to warm the whole gondola or cockpit, but close to them the air softened, gloves and mittens thawed, and the ice on clothing turned into damp frost. Crews knew the other side of this as well. Any open flame in a confined space meant the risk of carbon monoxide and fire, and in the history of polar flights, these fears were very real. So the stove often became the center of a quiet, sleeping camp. People took turns dozing around it, but at least one person always stayed awake enough to keep an eye on both the fire and the instruments. The sounds accompanying this sleep were almost always the same, whether the story was about Norge, Italia, the Graf Zeppelin, or the long-winged Ant 25. It was the ceaseless drone of engines in which an experienced ear could hear the slightest malfunction. The vibration of the structure resonating through bunk frames and floorboards, and the howl of wind pounding the envelope or skin, as if someone invisible were constantly knocking and whispering outside. Those who wrote memoirs of polar flights many years later admitted that they struggled to fall asleep in real silence. They missed the steady noise of the engines that over the years had turned into a kind of lullaby. But during the flights themselves, that same noise first wore them down, not letting the brain relax, and only then became a familiar sound wall behind which they could hide their tired thoughts. Polar day and polar night each stole people's sense of time in their own way, turning sleep into the only marker. If your eyes are closing, it means night has come, even if the horizon outside the window still glows milky white. The Graf Zeppelin crew later recalled how hard it was to understand when it was actually time to lie down, if the light barely changed and the ice outside always shone the same. In such conditions, commanders introduced artificial days. Certain hours were declared rest time, even if the body resisted, and the navigator or pilot had to literally force themselves to shut their eyes because the next shift was already set in the watch schedule. Sleep became less a bodily need and more an order to be carried out, and that strange feeling also stuck in their memory. On long-range aircraft, altitude added another layer of confusion. The higher the plane flew, the colder the air around the cockpit became, and the harder it was to relax while resting. Studies of thermal conditions in small cockpits show that with imperfect heating, the temperature around the pilot can drop to 0 or below, especially at the feet and by the walls, and this exactly matched what polar pilots experienced. So when someone lay down on crates or flooring, they always first checked what separated them from the metal: a poncho, a rolled-up jacket, a sack of cargo, any layer that would keep the body from touching the frozen skin of the aircraft. Such little details decided whether they would wake up an hour later with a mild chill or with dangerously numb limbs. It is striking that in these harsh conditions, the first systematic recommendations for organizing sleep and rest on long flights began to appear, albeit in a very practical field-style form. After the Italia flight and the analysis of its causes, experts paid special attention to accumulated fatigue and sleep deprivation, and the experience of missions like Chkalov's ANT-25 crossing showed that it was necessary to clearly regulate who was allowed to close their eyes and when. Commanders began to take shift schedules more seriously, trying not to let one person stay at the instruments for too many hours in a row, even if that person claimed to feel fine. This is how the realization slowly entered polar aviation practice that sleep was not a private matter, but a safety factor for the entire crew. The rituals of falling asleep looked almost identical across nations and expeditions, whether it was Norwegians and Italians on airships or Soviet pilots over the Arctic Ocean. Usually, it all started with a quick check. Is the belt fastened? Is there anything nearby that could hit you during a sudden maneuver? Where is the nearest handhold you can grab if the plane or airship suddenly lurches? Then, a person would shove a bag or rolled-up jacket under their head, wedge spare gear under their sides to create at least some imitation of a mattress, and only after that let their thoughts slowly drift off, listening to the very same engine hum that had annoyed them a minute earlier. Often they fell asleep with a last thought, not about themselves, but about the machine. Just let the engine sound stay the same while I'm asleep. Many memoirists remembered a special feeling of waking up on such flights. It was almost always abrupt and instantly tense. A person opened their eyes not to an alarm clock, but to a light nudge, a call from a crewmate, or a change in the noise outside, and in 1 or 2 seconds had to switch from sleep to full combat readiness. A pilot who had just been stretched out on an improvised bunk in a fur suit was, a moment later, already in the seat at the controls, checking the instruments, while the navigator, still chasing away the last traces of sleep, bent over the map and radio compass. This ragged rhythm, where the body almost never had time to understand whether it had actually rested, became normal for those who flew over the Arctic year after year. Over time, after the golden age of airships and the first record-setting flights had passed, many participants in these expeditions admitted that what stuck with them most was not the cold itself or the risk, but that peculiar state of half-sleep in the sky. They recalled lying in the gondola of Norge or in a bunk on the Graf Zeppelin, listening to the ice crackle beneath them even though they only saw it in daylight, and how in an aircraft cockpit somewhere over the pole, it felt as if the invisible white expanse was present in every breath. That sleep in fur masks, under the howl of the wind and the roar of machinery, became a border state. Rest, but always with half the mind left on watch, which is why, when they later spoke about conquering the Arctic from the air, they almost always mentioned not just routes and altitudes, but also how hard and strange it had been to learn to sleep in the frozen sky. When the airship Italia vanished in the white emptiness, the Arctic showed just how harshly it answers those who dare to spend dozens of sleepless, freezing hours above its ice. After the crash, a massive search and rescue operation began. Airplanes, ships, and expeditions from different countries headed north, and many pilots felt for the first time what it meant not just to fly along a route, but to circle over the ice for hours, hoping to spot a tiny speck of tents or wreckage. Their sleep became even more broken and exhausting because each of them knew, while they were resting, someone down there might be fighting for their life. In this way, the Italia tragedy turned the question of crew sleep from an internal issue of individual expeditions into an international topic of aviation safety. The pilots who took part in the search for Nobile and his men spent many hours in the air, returning to intermediate bases only to refuel, grab a quick meal, and close their eyes for a short while. They slept in the same cold cockpits where they had just been scanning ice cracks and pressure ridges, without taking off their fur suits and boots, because in just a few hours, they had to go back into the sky. In barracks and at temporary airfields, rest differed little from what they experienced in flight. The noise of generators, the banging of tools, the constant chatter of radios created a background hum that was hard to escape even under a greatcoat. In the search for the missing airship, a special rescuer's watch was born, where sleep turned into a brief pause between flights toward someone else's disaster. This story had another consequence. Many countries painfully realized how vulnerable large airships were in polar latitudes, and interest in them quickly gave way to interest in long-range airplanes. The airship Graf Zeppelin, which made its Arctic flight in the early 1930s, was in many ways the last major attempt to use such craft for scientific work over the ice, despite its relative success. Soon, it became obvious that the future of long-distance flights, including over the pole, belonged to heavy aircraft capable of flying faster, higher, and with less dependence on the whims of icy winds. Along with that, the way crews learned to sleep in the air changed too. Gondolas with bunks gave way to narrow fuselages, and cockpits with hard seats and improvised sleeping spots. Yet the memory of airships did not vanish without a trace. The experience of organizing life on board, including sleep, migrated into aviation. On the Graf Zeppelin, there were already separate areas for rest and work, even if greatly simplified during the polar mission. And this idea, to separate work and sleep spaces inside the same aircraft, turned out to be extremely valuable in new long-range planes, where pilots and navigators had once slept right on crates beside fuel tanks, small partitioned-off sections, light bunks, extra safety belts, and even simple curtains began to appear, letting them at least partially shield themselves from instrument light. But cold and noise remained the companions no one could escape at those altitudes. The aircraft that flew into the Arctic in the 1930s took on several roles at once. They carried cargo to new polar ports, searched for the missing, and supplied scientific stations on the ice. On each such flight, the same pattern repeated. Tense takeoff, many hours above the white desert, landing on a snowy strip or a leveled patch of ice, quick unloading, and then the crew looking for a place to spend a few hours somewhere warm, or at least out of the wind. Often, the best shelter turned out to be the aircraft itself. The engine shut down, the metal slowly cooling, but inside still just a bit less cold than outside. And that bit made all the difference. People hung mittens and fur coats on rivets and rails, spread bedding from crates and bales, and in this improvised den, they fell asleep, listening to the airframe lose its heat. Medical services and human factors specialists studied reports from such flights with growing attention, comparing how sleep deprivation and cooling affected crew errors. Research showed that even slight cooling of the extremities and neck area noticeably reduced reaction speed and movement precision, exactly the skills demanded of pilots and navigators forced to handle their machines in thick gloves and masks. Combined with chronic lack of sleep, this created a dangerous cocktail. A person might feel relatively alert, yet still miscalculate or react more slowly than usual in critical seconds. So recommendations increasingly stressed that planning sleep was just as important a part of flight preparation as fuel reserves or engine checks. These conclusions came out especially clearly in long flights like the ANT-25 mission under Valery Chkalov, which became a symbol of the new technology's capabilities. The flight over the North Pole took more than 2 days, and the 3 crew members had to not only fly the airplane, but also navigate, monitor the engine and fuel consumption, and at the same time avoid complete exhaustion. In their cramped cockpit, every centimeter of space counted. Behind the seats, near the wing spars, along the sides, anywhere you could put a foot or rest your head. Brief, sleeping spots appeared. At night, when there was only the black abyss of ocean and invisible ice beneath them, and the icy air of high altitude all around, these narrow pockets of calm were the only thing standing between the men and collapse. Step by step, as Soviet Arctic aviation built a network of bases from the Siberian coast to remote islands, these improvisations turned into a system. At some airfields and ice stations, special warm rooms were prepared for crews to rest briefly between flights, since returning to big cities each time was impossible. But even where there were barracks and stoves, airplanes still remained part of the sleeping landscape. In heavy blizzards or when bases were overloaded, pilots preferred to stay in their cockpits, in familiar places, so they could take off the moment the weather cleared. Their sleep could no longer be separated from the shapes and metal of the wings they spent most of their lives with. In parallel, the machines themselves were changing. Engineers began paying more attention to cockpit insulation, more efficient ventilation and heating, and later to creating pressurized spaces where pressure and temperature stayed stable. Early studies of pilot thermal comfort directly pointed to the need to account for cold airflows, the crew's location in the cockpit, and even the type of clothing they wore in order to reduce the risk of hypothermia and improve sleep quality on long flights. Arctic experience became a kind of testing ground for these developments. If a system could handle sub-zero temperatures and high winds there, it would all the more ensure safety and relative comfort in milder climates. True, cozy sleep in the sky was still far off, but the direction was set. Interestingly, pilots and navigators themselves usually approached sleep without extra heroics, but also without illusions. For them, it was not about romance. It was just another tool of the job, like the radio compass or the map. They understood that every momentary drop into drowsiness on duty might be very costly, so they valued authorized rest, even if it meant lying on crates, with the wind howling and metal creaking around them. In their memoirs, many admitted that what they remembered most were not the most dramatic episodes of a flight, but those rare times when they truly managed to relax for a few dozen minutes and wake up without a knot of anxiety in their chest. In that fragile gap between watches, in a half-quiet cockpit above the limitless ice, they felt themselves not just part of the machine, but simply people allowed to be a little tired. Over time, as jet aviation developed and large passenger airliners appeared, better insulation and heating systems gradually changed the very idea of sleep in the air. Crews began to get dedicated rest compartments, more comfortable bunks, the ability to turn off the lights and partly shut out the noise, while cabin pressure and temperature were kept far from the icy polar air that the pioneers had flown through. But it was the Arctic experience of the airships, Norge, Italia, and Graf Zeppelin, and of the first long-range aircraft like the AN-25 that showed designers how crucial it was to build in places for sleep and recovery, even if, on paper, these were just work hours in flight. The history of frozen nights over the pole became a quiet yet solid foundation for the soft blankets and warm windows that are taken for granted today. Over time, polar pilots and navigators began to notice that their sleep in the sky was gradually changing, not only their bodies, but also the very way they were used to falling asleep on the ground. After many days spent on airships and long-range aircraft, an ordinary bed felt too soft, too motionless, and almost disturbingly quiet. Some remembered how, at first, they would wake up in the middle of the night with a feeling of alarm. It seemed to them that the engine drone had disappeared, which meant something had gone wrong, even though they were already in a house, not in a gondola. In this way, the Arctic sky went on sounding in their dreams for a long time, even after they had returned to peaceful life. For those who had spent more than one season above the ice, sleep stopped being something single and continuous and turned into a set of short, trained states that they could almost switch on at will. They learned to fall asleep sitting up, half lying, wearing headphones and a mask, with their belts fastened, without the familiar feeling of safety that usually comes with getting into bed. Instead, safety was defined by other signs. The engines sounded normal. The instruments showed what they should. The straps across chest and waist were secure. If all of that was in order, the brain would allow itself to loosen its grip for a few minutes, and sometimes that was enough to hold out until the next watch. On airships, especially during the long voyages of the Graf Zeppelin, the sleep of crew and scientists resembled life in a strange multi-story house that never touched the ground. In the lower parts of the gondola, machines and engines thundered. In the scientific sections, lamps burned, and observations went on. And a little to the side, behind simple partitions or curtains, someone was trying to fall asleep on a narrow bunk. A special vertical schedule emerged. Someone was sleeping, someone was on watch, someone was observing the ice through the windows, all at the same time, under the same shell, lashed by the Arctic wind. Even in their sleep, people remained part of this living, constantly working organism. In airplanes, the picture was different. There, everything happened almost within a single volume, at arm's length. The pilot, navigator, and flight engineer slept and woke literally next to the place where, moments earlier, they had been flying the machine. As soon as they opened their eyes, the instruments, control cables, and steel framework that carried all their routes were right there in front of them again. Any movement from a crewmate, any rustle caused by a change in power immediately became a signal. Even asleep, a person subconsciously listened to these shifts, ready at any moment to jerk back to the levers and yoke. In such conditions, sleep stopped being an escape from reality and turned into a brief pause inside it. The constant cold added a very particular bodily experience to all of this. The body seemed to learn that relaxation always came with the risk of freezing. Pilots and navigators quickly absorbed a simple rule. You must not let yourself really drift off if you already feel yourself getting cold, because you won't notice it in your sleep and will wake up with hands and feet barely responding. So before closing their eyes, they checked not only their belts and instruments, but also their own warmth. Were the clothing layers tight enough? Had any fur edging gotten damp? Was there a draft getting into their boots? Sleep became a kind of pact with the cold. I'll loosen my grip just a little, and in return, you won't have time to reach my bones. Strikingly, many veterans of those flights remembered not so much vivid dream images as a special state between sleep and wakefulness that arose during short naps. A person would lie with their shoulder against the hard wall of the gondola or a crate in the cockpit, hear the engine drone, feel a slight swaying, and their thoughts would slowly grow viscous, as if covered with frost. But unlike ordinary sleep, there was almost always a thin thread of awareness left, tracking the rhythm of the noise. The moment that rhythm changed, the sleep snapped off instantly, as if someone had tugged on an invisible leash. This in-between state stuck in memory more strongly than the dreams themselves and returned in recollections decades later. For those hearing these stories now, while lying in a soft bed, there is a quiet lesson in all this. The people who flew over the pole in fragile airships and early airplanes learned to value every minute of rest, even when their blankets were fursuits and their silence was an endless roar. Their experience seems to say, where sleep is rare and hard won, it becomes a treasure you have to fight for, no less than for each kilometer of the route. And perhaps remembering them it becomes easier to simply close your eyes and accept an ordinary night as a luxury many of them could only dream of. It is interesting to imagine what waking up at altitude looked like. Somewhere above the ice under the dim glow of lamps, a person opened their eyes and at first had no idea where they were. Around them were metal walls, lashed down bags, someone's shadow swaying slightly with the vibration, and somewhere off to the side, the muffled voices of their comrades. Then their gaze would catch on familiar details: a chart on the table, the instruments, a window rimmed with dull ice, and reality would fall into place in an instant. Another flight, the Arctic again, many hours still ahead. In those moments, sleep seemed almost unreal, like a brief escape into another dimension from which you always returned to the same place, under a roaring dome of clouds. Perhaps one of the subtlest consequences of those nights in the sky was a change in their attitude towards silence. For many polar pilots and airship crew members, real silence was at first frightening. It lacked the familiar hum, the steady rhythm by which they judged whether everything was all right with the machine and the world outside. Only after months on the ground did they begin to perceive the absence of sound not as a threat, but as a rare kind of peace. Though deep down, they still remembered how terrifying silence could be if it came suddenly in flight after an unexpected engine failure. That is why many admitted it was easier for them to fall asleep to a muted noise, wind, a stove, even street traffic, than in an absolutely soundless room. Another lasting trace left by those frozen skies was tied to their sense of time. In the Arctic, normal ideas of day and night blurred. Polar day could last for weeks, and polar night could seem endless, and the real reference points became not wall clocks, but the schedule of watches and flights. After several expeditions, many noted that even back on land, they trusted the clock less and their own feeling of fatigue more. If they wanted to sleep, then their personal night had come, no matter what the dial said. In this way, polar experience slowly rewrote people's internal body clocks, making them live by the rhythm of expeditions rather than city streets. The Arctic seemed to test every sleep-related habit for strength. You couldn't afford the luxury of lying in for an extra hour if your turn at the controls was coming, but you also couldn't afford to save time by cutting rest, because over-fatigue led to mistakes that were sometimes fatal. In this tight knot of discipline and exhaustion, a special ethic was born. Respect for your own sleep and that of your crewmates. The understanding that giving someone an extra 15 minutes of rest meant raising the whole crew's chances of getting home. The calm, everyday act of falling asleep became part of shared responsibility, just as important as checking fuel or plotting a course. If you listen to these stories today, in a dark room before bed, they sound almost like a slow, drawn-out reminder of how fragile human strength is. The people who flew on Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin, or on the first long-range airplanes over the pole were not legendary heroes. They were simply doing their jobs, trying not to fall asleep too early and not to oversleep their turn so as not to let their comrades down. Their stories say that even in the harshest conditions, a person still needs a corner of quiet, even if it comes with the howl of wind and the roar of engines, to close their eyes and get their strength back. And perhaps, remembering them, it becomes easier to accept one's own fatigue and let yourself drift into sleep more calmly than those who once slept in the frozen skies of the Arctic. If the entire history of flights over the Arctic is imagined as a long, uneasy dream of humankind, then airships are its first anxious visions. In them, people were almost feeling their way in the dark, testing whether it was even possible to sleep in the sky without solid ground beneath, when a thin gondola shook in the wind, and beyond its walls lay not a field, but endless ice. Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin. Each of these craft was not only a technical experiment, but also an experiment on the human body and mind, forced to get used to nights without silence and without truly warm shelter. And those who once fell asleep in their gondolas unwittingly became the first sleep researchers in the frozen skies. The Arctic, like a strict teacher, showed step by step that any mistake in planning crew rest would be punished especially harshly. In the Italia tragedy, modern analysis has pointed directly to the role of accumulated fatigue and lack of sleep as factors that weakened the crew's ability to make decisions and respond to rapidly changing conditions. Years later, this conclusion became a textbook example of how human factors intertwine with technical and meteorological causes in aviation accidents. Since then, the story of Nobile and his crew has often appeared in flight safety manuals, not only as an account of an airship crash, but also as a warning about the price of sleep deprivation in extreme conditions. At the other end of this story stands the Graf Zeppelin, whose successful polar voyage showed that carefully planned life on board, including sleep, can greatly reduce risks. During the Arctic expedition, equipment and interiors were lightened, partitions removed, and comfortable cabins replaced with simple bunks and functional zones. Yet one principle was preserved: separate space for rest, even under strict weight limits. This experience was later cited in work on planning long scientific and demonstration flights, demonstrating that even in a record-oriented expedition, crew sleep remains a fundamental resource. When long-range airplanes replaced airships, the very geometry of sleep in the sky changed. In large gondolas, people could still move along corridors and pick a slightly warmer spot, but in the narrow cockpits of early polar aircraft, like the ANT-25, every spare centimeter had to serve several purposes at once. It held maps, tools, personal belongings, and improvised beds. Sleep literally grew into the fuselage. Crates turned into mattresses, folded coats into pillows, and the space behind the pilot's seat into the only possible corner of quiet between flights. People learned to weave their rest directly into the heart of the metal machine. But with the new technology came new threats. Altitudes increased, outside temperatures dropped, and pilot protection long lagged behind the ambitions of the routes. Studies of cockpit thermal conditions showed that with imperfect heating, temperature differences between the instrument area and the sidewalls could be significant, and around the pilot's feet and the floor, the air often stayed near freezing or below. In such conditions, lying down to sleep in the cockpit meant not only fighting noise, but literally defending yourself against heat loss, shoving any available material under your body to avoid direct contact with frozen metal panels. Sleep and survival again became almost inseparable. Soviet Arctic aviation added scale to this picture. Dozens and hundreds of flights to northern ports, drifting stations, and remote garrisons turned sleeping in the airplane into everyday routine rather than a one-off experiment. Pilots and navigators regularly spent nights in or beside their cockpits, waiting for weather to improve or for new tasks, and their stories filled reports and memoirs with monotonous yet telling details. They slept in furs, on crates, to the sound of wind and the knocking of freezing structures. At some bases, commanders deliberately arranged warm rooms for brief rest between flights, realizing that without this, discipline and alertness in the air quickly declined. No one there still needed convincing that sleep was vital for safety. Every freezing night made it obvious. At the same time, doctors and engineers took a growing interest in how exactly a person felt in these conditions. Human factors researchers studied reports of polar flights and accidents and concluded that fatigue and hypothermia rarely acted alone. They amplified each other, making errors more likely and reactions slower. Experiments and field observations agreed. Pilots who spent many hours in cold cockpits and lacked sleep coped worse with precise actions and calculations, even if they believed they were still alert. On the basis of these findings, the first clear recommendations on rest schedules for long-haul flights began to take shape. Stories like Valery Chkalov's flight over the North Pole to the United States in the ANT-25 became examples not only of technical daring, but also of the skillful management of human strength. The 3 crew members, who remained in the air for more than 2 days, could carry out this flight precisely because they stuck carefully to their rotation, let each other sleep at least a little in the cramped cockpit, and treated their sleep as a resource as precious as the fuel in the tanks. Later, analysis of such flights found its way into training materials for pilots, emphasizing that extreme range is not an achievement in itself if the limits of human endurance are ignored. In this sense, the Arctic became a stern examiner for every ambitious route. Gradually, piston aircraft gave way to jet airliners, and with them, habits of sleep in the sky changed as well. New planes received pressurized, better insulated cabins and dedicated crew rest compartments on long-haul routes with real bunks, adjustable lighting, and some degree of soundproofing. Yet, the legacy of polar airships and aircraft was still clear in these designs. Engineers built in rest areas from the outset, understanding that many hours in the air without rotation and sleep were unacceptable for pilots. In that quiet space, hidden from passengers, lived the memory of those who once fell asleep strapped into freezing gondolas above the pole. Modern heating, ventilation, and soundproofing systems have created a new level of comfort. But human factors research still points back to the lessons of the Arctic. Regulations for air crews now clearly spell out duty time limits, mandatory rest periods, and requirements for the conditions in which pilots must sleep between flights. All of this grew out of decades of experience, including dramatic polar episodes. Even when someone lies down today in a warm, nearly silent crew bunk on a long-haul jet, somewhere in the lines of the manuals behind their schedule echo the stories of Italia and the first Soviet polar flights. The frozen skies are invisibly present in the everyday routine of modern aviation. And still, despite technical progress, the psychological experience of those first polar dreamers remains unique and hard to replicate. They slept in a world where beyond the wall there was no city, no lights, no familiar infrastructure, only snow, ice, and emptiness stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Every awakening reminded them that between them and that world there was only a thin layer of metal and gas, and that any sound, any shift in vibration could trigger a chain of events that left no room for sleep. Perhaps that is why the memory of those nights stuck so firmly in their minds, as a strange blend of anxiety and calm. If you listen to these stories now, in the half-dark of a room, they sound soft and slightly muffled, as if coming from those same gondolas and cockpits where lamplight barely cut through tobacco smoke and misted breath. There is almost no pathos in them, just honest accounts from people who learned to fall asleep where it seemed impossible. Amid the roar of engines, the creak of ice-coated structures, and the endless wind behind a thin skin of metal, they opened up a paradoxical space for all of us. A sky where you can not only fly, but also rest for a moment while staying on guard. And remembering them before going to sleep, it is easy to feel your own breathing grow a little deeper and steadier, as if falling into step with the measured hum of those distant, long silent engines. Try to imagine a single composite flight over the Arctic that combines traits of Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin, Soviet polar routes, and the long-range An-T-25 crossing. The aircraft lifts off from an ice airstrip or a mooring mast, climbs, and from that moment time starts to flow differently. Hours and days turn into a chain of watches, reports, and short episodes of sleep. Below, ice fields drift by in slow motion, and inside are people who already know that for the next dozens of hours, their home will be a booming gondola or a narrow cockpit where even sleep is subordinated to the route. In this imagined flight, it is easy to see the common rules by which almost all real polar crews lived. At first, the body still remembers the land, the habit of sleeping at night, not by range and shift schedules. In the first hours of the flight, people are cheerful, discussing the weather, cracking jokes, checking the instruments a bit more often than necessary, just as participants in the early Arctic expeditions described. But as the clock hands pass into the second and third day, conversations thin out and saving strength comes to the forefront. Every extra gesture, every needless word seems to spend precious energy that will be needed later in nighttime turbulence or when hunting for a strip of ice to land on. This is where sleep first starts to feel not like a simple need, but like a carefully rationed resource. The commander of such a flight, drawing on the experience of predecessors from airships to early long-range airplanes, sets up the watch rotation in advance so that no one ends up at the controls for too long without relief. Everything is taken into account. Who tolerates lack of sleep better? Who handles cold more steadily? Whose ear is sharper to changes in engine noise? Exactly the sort of details mentioned in reports and analyses of polar flights. Some start their shift in daylight, others prepare for the night watch, knowing that at night, when there is neither sun nor a clear horizon outside the windows, it is especially important to keep a clear head. In this duty, roster lies the quiet lesson of the Italia disaster, where sleep debt played a noticeable role. The first attempts to sleep on such a mission are often the hardest. The body still resists the very idea of sleeping in a fursuit, in noise, to the crackling of ice on the panels. A person settles down on an improvised bunk made of crates or on a light cot, as on the Graf Zeppelin during its polar flight, and spends a long time trying to find a position where the harness does not dig into the shoulder and the cold air does not sneak down the back of the neck. But after a few missions, that discomfort is replaced by habit. The body seems to learn to fall asleep faster as soon as the familiar ritual is completed. Tug the fur collar up, check the buckle on the belt, make sure there is nothing sharp nearby. Even this short transition from wakefulness to dozing off becomes part of professional skill. The night segment of the flight is special. When it is dark outside or when the world has sunk into gray polar twilight, the instruments and a few dim lights in the cockpit become the only reference points in space, and fatigue creeps in especially quickly, as veterans of many different polar expeditions noted. On airships like Norge and Italia, drafts in the keel and passageways between compartments were felt most sharply at night. Without the distraction of sunlight, the cold seemed to grow denser and more insistent, driving people more often toward the stoves. In airplanes, the night leg often coincided with the highest cruising altitude, and therefore the bitterest cold pressing against the thin walls of the cockpit. All of this makes even a short sleep fragile and easily shattered. In such hours, the little islands of warmth matter most. Spots where the skin of the aircraft is warmed by proximity to the engine, or where it is possible to place a small heater. Those with a few free minutes on the schedule queue up to sit or lie there. Fur mittens are placed closer to the heat source, and they themselves try to position their bodies so at least chest and back do not chill. Polar flight reports often stress that such seemingly mundane details had a serious impact on crew performance. Warmed hands and feet allowed more precise work with instruments and controls. Sleep woven into this small, warm circle became especially valuable. Somewhere around the middle of the flight, after many hours spent over the monotonous landscape of ice, a strange sense of stretched time sets in. Something both airship crews and pilots wrote about. The clock shows a perfectly real duration, but subjectively it feels much longer, and the short bouts of sleep are no longer perceived as separate nights. They blur into fragments of one very long day. People stop sorting memories by calendar dates and instead remember them by flights or by watches, as so many polar aviation memoirs show. In this blurring of the calendar, one can clearly feel how deeply the Arctic intrudes into a human being's natural rhythm. In airplane cockpits, where everyone is close together, this blurring of time shows up even more sharply. The pilot who was just flying the machine is, a few minutes later, lying on the floorboards or on crates just behind the seat, and his place is taken by a partner. A few hours later, they swap again, and this rotation repeats over and over until the route is done. In the cramped space, it is easy to lose track of what day it is or how long it has been since takeoff. The real markers are not the hands of a clock, but the inner sense of how many times you have managed to fall asleep on those crates and how many times you woke to someone's light tap on your shoulder. Sleep becomes a watch marker, not part of a calendar. On airships, especially on the Graf Zeppelin, this was compounded by the unusual layering of the living space. At the same time, scientific observations, navigation work, engine servicing in the keel walkways, and someone's sleep behind a curtain in the living section could all be going on. And all of these processes sensed each other through the vibration of the frame and the shared noise. Whoever was falling asleep could literally feel the pulse of the entire structure beneath them. Footsteps on metal grating, shifts in engine operation, even people moving along ladders. All of it carried through thin partitions. So even in moments of rest, there remained a tangible feeling of being part of the ship's single organism. With every hour of the flight, not only fatigue but also experience accumulated. The crew began to feel more and more precisely the boundary between the normal lack of sleep they were used to and the dangerous exhaustion that had already led to mistakes in famous Arctic stories. After the Italia crash and other incidents, experts stressed that pilots and commanders had to be able to admit in time that human resources were nearly spent, even if the technology was still coping. In this composite flight, that shows up in small things. Someone forgets to enter a note in the log. Someone stares at a gauge needle longer than usual before grasping what it is showing. And those are exactly the signals that trigger a hard decision. Get this person to sleep immediately, even at the cost of reshuffling tasks. By the end of such a mission, sleep becomes especially dense and heavy. A body that has been running on willpower for a long time finally starts letting a person sink deeper into drowsiness as soon as there is a chance to lie down, or at least lean back. People fall asleep faster than at the start of the flight, sometimes in a matter of minutes. Something polar pilots and airship crews often mentioned in their recollections. But it is at this stage that the role of crewmates grows. Waking someone at the right time, checking how they are after rest, not letting them go on watch in a half-conscious state. In these caring little rituals lay the real meaning of crew, especially in the harsh conditions of the Arctic. When at last the route nears its end and a strip of ice or an airfield appears beneath the wings or gondola, consciousness seems to snap back into a normal time scale. Landing, the fading roar of the engine, a hatch opening, and a familiar but somehow different cold hits the face. Here, the wind is no longer mixed with the vibration of the frame. It is free and sharp. The crew climbs out, performs the required checks and reports, and then finally returns to what they have been dreaming of the whole flight. The chance to lie not on crates or a narrow bunk, but on a normal bed, or at least a flat bunk in a warm room. And almost always, the same line appears in their accounts. At first, the ground feels strangely motionless. Yet even in that normal bed, many find they cannot fall asleep for a long time, as participants in polar flights often admitted. They miss the background hum, the faint but constant vibration they grew used to over the long hours spent in the air. Some find it easier to drift off if the wind is rattling outside the window, or the distant sound of traffic filters in. This gives the subconscious a familiar safety signal that in the sky meant the engines are running, the course is holding. And in this strange aftertaste of the flight, one can see especially clearly how deeply the experience of sleeping in the frozen sky has grown into their perception of the world. All these details, from the watch rotations to the habit of listening to a crewmate's breathing in their sleep, make up the invisible legacy of polar flights on airships and early airplanes. They are not as striking as headline-grabbing records or disasters, but it is through them that the Arctic slowly taught aviation to respect human sleep as much as metal strength and fuel reserves. Today, when long-haul air crews lie down in enclosed rest compartments with soft mattresses and adjustable lighting, their schedules still quietly carry the imprint of those who once dozed in fur masks beneath a thin skin of metal above the North Pole. And listening to these stories before sleep, it is easy to feel just a little closer to the people who first learned to sleep in the frozen skies, not for romance, but simply to make it through to the next dawn over the white fields of ice. When you look at today's photos of polar aviation, it is hard to believe how little is left of those bare metal cockpits and thin gondolas where the first conquerors of the Arctic sky learned to sleep. Modern aircraft flying over northern latitudes have insulated fuselages, well-designed heating and ventilation systems, and on long routes, the crews use dedicated rest compartments with real beds or comfortable seats. Yet, in every drawing of these rest areas, in every line of regulations about shifts and breaks, the experience is invisibly present of those who once fell asleep in fur masks on cargo crates, strapped by a belt to the floor of an airship or to a narrow shelf in an aircraft cockpit. Crew duty regulations today seem like something completely self-evident. Maximum shift length, mandatory hours of rest before and after a flight, limits on how many night sectors can be flown in a row. But many of these rules grew out of the analysis of those very polar stories where overwork and lack of sleep turned out to be an unseen but deadly companion of bold routes. The investigation of the Italia crash and other demanding expeditions showed how strongly chronic fatigue increases the likelihood of error, even when the aircraft is technically sound and the weather does not appear overtly dangerous. That is why, in modern flight safety documents, crew sleep stands alongside engine checks and route preparation. Engineers who designed today's cockpits long ago stopped seeing the pilot as an abstract control point. Now their condition is treated as part of the overall safety system. Reports on thermal comfort and ergonomics, rooted in the experience of cold cockpits on early polar flights, describe in detail how temperature is distributed around the seat, where drafts form, and which materials retain heat best. This is a direct response to those old accounts in which pilots woke on the floor with numb hands and feet because the thin fuselage skin had frozen solid overnight. The designer's task now is to ensure that even during a short sleep in the air, the body does not spend its last reserves simply fighting the cold. Even with warm cabins and better soundproofing, however, the human factor has not gone anywhere. The polar sky still demands that people treat their own sleep in a special way. Modern Arctic pilots, like their predecessors, must reckon with polar day and night when normal internal rhythms are disrupted and the real reference points become not morning and evening, but the schedule of flights and watches. So even now in Arctic expeditions, rest planning remains not only a medical matter, but also a question of practical experience that has been quietly accumulating since the days of Norge and Graf Zeppelin. In this sense, the early airships can be seen as flying laboratories for studying how a person sleeps in an unfamiliar environment. In the gondolas of Norge and Italia, people for the first time spent many hours in a row in the air above the pole, trying to rest with feeble heating, constant noise, and cramped quarters. Their experience, from brief cat naps while sitting at the instruments to improvised bunks in the keel between girders, became the factual foundation without which later requirements for habitable conditions on new aircraft could not have been formulated. Every cold hour of their sleep turned into a line in future recommendations and diagrams. Graf Zeppelin added another important layer to this experience. It showed that even in a relatively comfortable craft, comfort can and should be sacrificed for scientific payload, but that one cannot completely abandon rest zones. During its polar flight, some of the luxurious interiors were stripped out, cabins were lightened, and furniture was replaced with simple bunks. Yet the principle of separating work and sleeping areas survived. That approach later migrated into long-haul airplanes. Even if conditions on board are far from luxurious, a dedicated compartment, or at least a corner for crew sleep, has to be provided. Thus, evolution moved from airships to jetliners, but preserving human sleep remained its hidden driving nerve. Early polar airplanes like the ANT-25, on the contrary, showed an extreme form of existence in a cramped cockpit, where work and rest literally overlaid one another. On Valery Chkalov's flight over the North Pole, 3 men took turns sleeping and working in a single small space where every protrusion of the fuselage, every crate and beam became part of their temporary bedroom. This experience taught aviation that even under severe space constraints, it is necessary to provide at least minimal opportunities to change posture, warm up the extremities, and get short, deep sleep. Otherwise, an extreme range route becomes a threat to the crew. Reports on such flights helped drive home the idea that the human being is no less fragile a component than the light metal of the wing. Soviet Arctic aviation, which for decades supplied ports and stations in the north, turned these one-off lessons into everyday routine. Pilots and navigators grew used to sleeping between flights, sometimes in barracks, sometimes in tents on the ice, sometimes right in the cockpits while the aircraft sat on a frozen strip waiting for weather or unloading. The same motifs run through their accounts, sleeping in furs on cargo crates, with the wind drumming on the skin of the fuselage, being jolted awake by the signal for a new flight, feeling that a real night is not the dark hours, but the few when routes can be forgotten. Those motifs then fed into stricter rules on work-rest cycles for northern crews. Medical research inspired by these practical observations became a bridge from intuitive solutions to formal standards. Scientists studying the impact of hypothermia and lack of sleep on pilot reactions drew on real data from polar expeditions and flights, including materials from the Italia disaster and other incidents. They showed that drops in body temperature, especially combined with long-term fatigue, sharply worsen movement accuracy and the speed of information processing, things that are directly tied to working the instruments. Based on these findings, requirements for cockpit heating, crew clothing, and mandatory rest periods were tightened, especially under extreme conditions. If you trace a mental line from the first gondola above the pole to today's pressurized cabins, it becomes clear that the history of sleep in the Arctic is not a side note, but one of the main threads in the development of polar aviation as a whole. Behind every current rule about shifts, breaks, and rest conditions stand someone's night watches in the half-dark, someone's hands shaking from the cold, someone's short, anxious dreams against the background of engine noise. And although today's crews most often fall asleep in far softer, warmer conditions, the very idea of sleeping in the sky without losing vigilance was born there, in the frozen air above the Arctic Ocean. Listening to these stories, it is easy to feel the distance between past and present shrink. The person who now lies down in a warm room, puts on a video, and falls asleep to a calm narration is, in essence, repeating the same gesture as the polar pilot settling on cargo crates in the cockpit. Both are looking for a corner where they can briefly let go of control and trust someone's voice, the wind outside the window, or the hum of engines. The difference is that the first did it beneath a thin skin of metal with endless ice beyond, while now there are decades of experience and layers of technology between the listener and that emptiness. But the memory of those who first learned to sleep in the frozen skies remains a soft background to our own, far more peaceful sleep. Over time, those who had spent their best and hardest years in the frozen skies of the Arctic slowly began to put that experience down on paper, in reports, diaries, memoirs, and spoken accounts. Official documents usually kept to dry lines about routes, altitudes, and fuel consumption, but between them, short phrases would slip through about excessive crew fatigue or insufficient rest before departure. And in personal recollections, it finally became clear what hid behind those words. Nights spent on crates, sleep in fur masks, and that particular half-sleep that became normal for polar pilots and airship crews. It is from these quiet testimonies that the true voices of the people who slept in the frozen sky can still be heard. The Italian engineer and airship commander Umberto Nobile, who lived through the triumph of Norge and the tragedy of Italia, left behind not only technical descriptions, but also human details of life in flight. In his stories and in later studies devoted to the Italia disaster, the theme of fatigue surfaces again and again. Many days of continuous work, night watches, dozing right in the keel, or at the instruments when the eyes close by themselves. For him and his companions, sleep was never a separate chapter of the expedition. It was stitched into the fabric of events as one more risk factor and one more limited resource that had to be managed no less carefully than fuel or lift. In that combination of engineering precision and human fragility, the real nerve of the airship era can be felt. The Norwegian polar explorer Roald Amundsen, who took part in the Norge flight across the North Pole, came into the sky with immense experience of life in the ice from his sledge expeditions. He knew well that sleep in polar conditions is always a compromise between the desire to rest and the need to stay ready for sudden changes. And this attitude is easy to recognize in the discipline of the Norge flight. There, as in his land expeditions, sleep was divided strictly by schedule, and people never allowed themselves to disconnect completely from what was happening around them, even when lying under fur blankets in the gondola. The routines of polar camps and marches simply moved upward into the air over the ice. The German Graf Zeppelin left a rich trail from its Arctic voyage in the early 1930s. Reports, photographs, and descriptions of life on board. These materials show how carefully life in the air was organized. Separate work areas, scientific posts, rest spaces, light bunks instead of heavy furniture, comforts stripped out in favor of payload. Yet even in such a well-planned craft, sleep remained a matter of compromise. Overlapping noises, constant frame vibration, polar day beyond the windows, and the awareness that beneath you lay not a flat field, but cracks and pressure ridges. The people who wrote about this flight rarely called themselves heroes, but between the lines it is clear. Learning to fall asleep in such a world was an art of its own. On the Soviet side, the memory of sleep in the frozen sky has survived above all in the stories of Arctic aviation pilots and participants in long flights such as the ANT-25 crossing of the North Pole. Their memoirs devote far more space not to spectacular records, but to everyday routine, arranging life in the cockpit, hunting for a warm corner, fighting ice buildup, dozing on equipment crates. Valery Chkalov's flight over the pole to the United States became a legend not only because of its range, but also because 3 men managed to endure more than 2 days in a cramped, partially freezing cockpit by honestly rotating watches and short sleep periods. Later, exactly these stories were used as examples of how important it is to pair bold routes with a sober respect for human limits. In many polar pilots' recollections, the same detail recurs. They rarely remembered specific dreams, but they remembered very clearly how they fell asleep. Most often it followed the same script: checking the safety belt, a habitual glance at the instruments, or at a sleeping crewmate, tugging the fur collar into place, a few deep breaths through the mask, and only then permission to close their eyes. It was almost a ritual, like the little routines many people have before bed on the ground. But here, every movement also had a practical purpose. A poorly tightened strap or a heavy object left nearby could mean injury in a sudden maneuver. Sleep became a continuation of discipline, not its opposite. Equally telling is how differently these people remembered the noise that accompanied their rest. For some, engine roar and wind whistle remained forever something hostile, an obstacle they had to endure for the sake of any rest at all. They wrote about aching ears and the long ringing in the head after landing. For others, the same noise gradually turned into a kind of lullaby. The steady hum of the engine meant everything was going according to plan. The course was holding. Danger was still at bay. In their accounts, there are lines about how hard it later was to fall asleep in silence, without that background, which their bodies had learned to treat as a sign of safety rather than threat. This paradoxical shift shows how deeply a professional environment can rewrite sleep habits. Documents and studies devoted to the Italia crash also show how specialists' views on the human factor slowly changed. At first, attention focused on technical causes, design, weather, controllability, but later questions about how tired the crew was, how many hours of sleep they had before the crucial flight, and how duties were divided became ever more prominent. Looking back over this data, experts said openly that chronic lack of sleep and overwork had become an important part of the chain of events. So, within the professional community, the idea took hold that sleep in the polar sky is not a minor domestic issue, but a subject for serious study. Similar conclusions appear in materials on the development of Soviet Arctic aviation, which describe not only routes and aircraft, but also how life on bases and en route was organized. There, official texts already speak plainly about the need to create conditions for crew rest at intermediate airfields, to equip warm rooms, to provide proper breaks between flights, especially during intense periods. Even if in reality, it was not always possible to follow every recommendation, their very appearance shows that polar experience, including bitter lessons, was heard and thought through. In these lines, the path is visible from heroic improvisation toward systematic concern for people's sleep in the air. For historians of aviation and polar exploration, the most valuable passages today are often those that describe not only hardware, but the habitat on board. Descriptions of the Norge gondola or the living quarters of the Graf Zeppelin mention heavy curtains against drafts, how sleeping places were assigned, how clothing was dried, how the few warm spots were shared. Materials on Soviet polar flights are full of photographs of people sleeping right in their fur suits, slumped against the aircraft wall or sitting at a table in a base building, their faces frozen with exhaustion. These small, everyday details make the history of sleep over the Arctic tangible and alive. It is striking that many polar flyers, looking back years later, spoke not so much about fear as about the peculiar calm brought by those short periods of rest. They described how, in those moments, their bodies finally stopped shivering, their breathing evened out, and the engine noise slipped into the background like distant surf. They felt as if they were inside a small cocoon of warmth and light in the middle of an endless icy desert, and that feeling of a tiny island of safety stayed with them more strongly than any anxiety. For many, it was precisely these moments that made the heavy watches and long hours over the pressure ridges feel worthwhile. The portraits of fatigue and sleep that have come down to us from that era are almost always collective. They rarely feature a single lone hero. Instead, we see a team. People rotating at the instruments, handing each other the warmest spot by the stove, waking a comrade with a light touch on the shoulder if the engine note or weather outside changes. In this shared care for each other's sleep lived a special polar ethic that later generations of pilots inherited. You cannot think only about how tired you are. You must also see how your partner is doing. Even in the harshest, coldest cockpits and gondolas, something deeply human and warm survived. Today, when historians and readers return to these stories, they often see not only technological or geopolitical dimensions, but also a quiet, almost intimate one. How people in extreme conditions went looking for a corner of peace. The airships Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin, the Soviet polar aircraft and bases, all of this becomes, among other things, the backdrop to a simple but vital question: how to preserve humanity where cold and exhaustion can easily erase it. The answer left to us by the participants of those expeditions is simple and clear. Guard each other's sleep, share warmth, make sure no one is left alone with their fatigue. Perhaps that is why their stories are so oddly soothing when read or listened to before bed. And if now, lying in darkness and silence, you picture those gondolas and cockpits, it is easy to see an invisible route rising far overhead, full of night watches, brief naps, and rare but infinitely precious minutes of real rest. Up there, above the ice, every such moment was the result of a long struggle with cold, tiredness, and fear. Down here, on the ground, it becomes a gentle reminder that sleep is not weakness, but strength, without which even the boldest flights are impossible. And knowing that, it may be easier to let your own eyelids grow heavy, your breathing steady, and your thoughts slowly quiet. The way conversations once faded in those gondolas and cockpits where people fell asleep in fursuits to the hum of distant engines. When you look back on all these stories, Norge over the pole, Italia drifting to sleep in a shuddering gondola, Graf Zeppelin with its light bunks and long scientific watches, the Soviet aircraft over the Arctic Ocean, it feels like one long dream of humanity stretching across decades. In that dream, hulls and engines change, airships vanish, and jetliners appear. But one thing stays the same: a person who, somewhere between ice and clouds, closes their eyes and entrusts their life to a thin shell, and the comrades nearby. Every such moment of rest, wrestled from cold and exhaustion, becomes a tiny brick in the invisible foundation of modern aviation safety. For those who flew in airship gondolas, sleep was more a concession to the body than a habit, something granted cautiously, like letting an exhausted horse pause before the next dash. Nobili and his team on Italia knew that any extra hour of dozing could mean losing control of the situation. But a total refusal to rest inevitably led to mistakes, as the later analysis of the disaster grimly confirmed. Amundsen, heading toward the pole on Nor, brought into the sky the strict regimen he knew from sledge expeditions: sleep by schedule, always with one foot in reality, always ready to rise at the first call. In these approaches, you can feel a generation for whom fatigue was as dangerous as a storm. The crew of Graf Zeppelin on its Arctic voyage lived in a very different, almost laboratory-like world, yet their nights were also ruled by the ice beneath the keel. They slept on lightweight bunks, behind curtains, in a shared space where engine noise and footsteps on the deck carried through thin partitions. And every awakening came with the realization that the ship was still far from land and the expedition was still underway. Scientists, navigators, sailors, they all shared the same background of sound and cold, and so sleep became a common, not a personal resource. If someone did not rest enough, the work of the entire expedition suffered. That idea of shared responsibility later carried over into long-haul airline practice. The move to airplanes looked like a step toward speed and progress, but for crew sleep, it meant a new round of trials. Unlike the spacious gondolas, the cockpits of early polar aircraft resembled iron cocoons where every centimeter was taken up by instruments, fuel, and cargo, and people had to carve out a place to rest literally in the folds of the structure. On the ANT-25 flight over the North Pole, 3 crew members took turns spending hours in that cramped space, learning to sleep where, a moment earlier, someone had been at the controls. And only a strict watch schedule allowed them to bring the aircraft to the American shore. Reports on such missions already stated outright that without a well-thought-out sleep regimen, range records would have been impossible. Soviet Arctic aviation turned these tense experiments into everyday routine. Pilots and navigators flew for years to northern ports and stations, developing those unspoken rules that would later appear in memoirs. Never fall asleep until you are sure about your partner. Never leave a comrade alone in a cold cockpit. Share the warm corners and those rare moments of truly deep sleep. They slept in tents on the ice, in barracks by airfields, in freezing fuselages, and every time the Arctic reminded them that exhaustion accumulates faster there than in familiar latitudes, that sense of accelerated wear on the body became one of the key arguments for strict work and rest regulations. Doctors and human factors specialists, looking closely at these flights, saw in them an almost ready-made research base. Real cases of overwork described in materials on Italia and other polar flights showed that lack of sleep and cold do not act as 2 separate factors, but amplify each other. A freezing, sleep-deprived person loses precision and clarity of thought much faster than someone who is merely tired. Experiments simulating cockpit temperatures only confirmed this. Even slight cooling of hands and feet, combined with long duty, sharply degrades reaction times. From here came the idea of treating sleep as one of the key elements in the flight safety system, not just a private need. Gradually, regulations, manuals, and textbooks began to include concrete numbers. How many hours in a row a crew can work, how much minimum rest is required before a demanding flight, how often people must be rotated on long routes. These rules did not appear from thin air. Behind them stood studied tragedies. Above all, Italia, and successful but extremely grueling journeys like the ANT-25 flight. Every time experts analyzed what had allowed a given crew to bring the aircraft home, it turned out that not only piloting skills mattered, but also the ability to manage one's strength, to sleep on time, even in the harshest conditions. That is how the idea took root in professional culture. A well-rested crew is not weak, but competent. Today, when long-haul pilots step into separate rest compartments with real bunks, curtains, adjustable lighting, and stable temperature, it feels as if this has always been obvious. But if you rewind history, you see that these warm, quiet spaces grew out of very different scenes. Gondolas, where people slept in furs under the engine roar. Cockpits, where a bed was just a crate under your back. Icy airstrips, where sleep had to be shared with wind and snow. Even modern seat ergonomics and how ventilation flows are routed around the pilot are built on those same studies that once tried to understand why cold, exhausted people in the Arctic made more mistakes. In that sense, every comfortable seat in the sky is a small legacy of those who slept in the frozen heavens. Perhaps the most important legacy, though, lies not in technology, but in how human vulnerability is viewed. The pioneers of polar flight, from Amundsen and Nobile to Soviet pilots, showed plainly that no matter how bold the route, a person still needs simple things: warmth, food, sleep, the support of comrades. Their expeditions taught aviation to see crews not as abstract system elements, but as living people whose fatigue, fear, or calm directly shape events. And today, when a pilot signs off on a duty roster or steps into a rest compartment, that gesture carries the weight of decades of hard-won experience over the ice. For someone listening to all this while lying in a dark room before sleep, the link may seem almost invisible, but it is there. The person who puts on a quiet story about how people once slept over the Arctic in order to drift off more easily is, in their own way, continuing that long path. They too are using a voice, a story, and the feeling of a protected space as an antidote to the day's fatigue and anxiety. Only now, instead of a gondola or cockpit, there is a familiar room. Instead of a fur suit, a blanket. Instead of the howl of wind, a faint noise outside the window, and the knowledge that people once managed to fall asleep in far harsher conditions quietly supports you. If they could rest there, then here you can allow yourself to let go. Far back in the past, the engines of Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin, and those first aircraft that crossed the North Pole have long since fallen silent. But in every modern flight, in every roster of shifts and breaks, in every warm crew rest compartment, lives the memory of those who first realized that sleeping in the sky is not a whim, but a necessity as vital as strong wings and a reliable engine. Their nights over the ice have become our ordinary nights under a normal roof. And as you close your eyes, you can imagine an invisible route of these stories passing high above, calm and slow, like an airship gliding over white fields. And then your own sleep becomes a little deeper and softer, as if it had borrowed some of the warmth of those distant minutes of rest, wrested from the Arctic. As a long flight over the Arctic draws to a close, a strange split sets in. The body already knows that soon it will finally be able to lie down for real, in warmth and silence. But the mind has not yet had time to believe that the drone of the engines is about to fall quiet for good. Pilots and navigators returning from flights on Norge, Graf Zeppelin, or Soviet polar aircraft described this state in almost the same way. The last hours seem the longest. Fatigue presses down especially hard, and yet a second wind arrives, the knowledge that land lies ahead. In these moments, even short sleep changes its character. It is no longer quite so guarded, a little deeper, because somewhere ahead, the runway or mooring mast is already looming. And still, until the very moment of touchdown, no one allows themselves to relax completely. After landing, crews usually went through a short but very intense phase. They had to fill out logs, hand in reports, check the condition of the aircraft, sort through cargo or scientific equipment. All this time, they were still in the same fur suits and the same boots they had worn in flight, and the fatigue built up like snow on the wings. But when they were finally released to barracks, a hotel, or at least a warm room on the base, the strangest part of coming home began. Trying to fall asleep without the sound of engines. Many participants in polar flights remembered their first nights on the ground as restless. Their bodies seemed to keep listening for a drone that was no longer there, checking whether everything was all right with a machine that was already standing still. Only after several days did the inner rhythm begin to shift back toward ordinary life. For many, this return to normal sleep was a real test, no less difficult than the flight itself. A pilot who had become used to falling asleep strapped in, sitting up, in constant vibration, suddenly found himself on a motionless bed, in silence, and it felt almost wrong. A navigator who had spent the whole mission dozing in 20 or 30-minute snatches could not instantly switch to a normal 8-hour sleep. His body kept waking every few hours, checking imaginary instruments. Memoirs mention this only rarely, but when they do, there is a note of surprise. Could it really be so hard to return to what once seemed natural? The Arctic changed even the simplest habits, and sleep was no exception. Some never fully returned to their old sleep at all. Veterans of polar flights admitted that for the rest of their lives they found it easier to fall asleep with some sort of background noise. Wind outside, the hum of heating pipes, the distant murmur of traffic. For them, this sound was not a disturbance, but a kind of safety anchor. Familiar from those nights when the steady drone of engines meant everything was going according to plan, and it was safe to rest a little. In that sense, their inner world preserved the imprint of the frozen sky forever, a fragment of that cold, thunderous space where sleep had been a reward for endurance and comradeship. And when they went to bed in retirement, in warm homes far from the Arctic, somewhere deep in their memory, that same drone still sounded quietly. To society, these people often remained heroes of records and achievements. Crossings of the North Pole, rescues of lost expeditions, the opening up of Arctic routes. But when they themselves were asked what they remembered most, their answers were often unexpected. Not the moment of reaching the pole, not the applause on returning, but those rare minutes of calm in the gondola or cockpit when they could truly relax and fall asleep, trusting their lives to their comrades and their machine. In these quiet admissions lies the real truth about polar aviation. Its greatness was built not only on daring routes, but also on the ability to conserve one another's strength, share warmth, wake in time, and give rest in time. It was an art no less important than flying itself. The history of sleep in the frozen skies of the Arctic did not end with the disappearance of airships or the arrival of modern aircraft. It merely changed form, becoming part of professional culture and regulations. Today, every rule about crew duty times, every requirement for onboard rest facilities, every instruction on maximum shift length carries within it the trace of those old flights when people slept in fur suits to the howl of the wind. The experience of Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin, and T-25, and hundreds of other lesser-known journeys over the ice has gradually turned into a body of knowledge about how to preserve a human being in the sky. And although the participants in those expeditions have long since gone, their sleep lives on in every safe flight. For someone getting ready for bed today, these stories may seem distant, almost fantastic. It is hard to imagine falling asleep in such cold, noisy, uncomfortable conditions. Yet it is precisely in this distance that their calming power lies. If people could find rest up there, above the pressure ridges, in shuddering gondolas and freezing cockpits, then in our warm beds, there is little reason to fear ordinary tiredness. Their experience seems to whisper that sleep is a right you must allow yourself, even when the world around you is noisy. A pause without which no real journey is possible, in the sky or on the ground. And remembering those who slept in the frozen heavens makes it easier to close your own eyes and trust the quiet. High above us, in that same Arctic, aircraft still fly today, and their crews still rotate watches and short periods of onboard sleep. But their conditions are no longer comparable to those of the pioneers. Warm cockpits, comfortable seats, heating and ventilation systems, separate rest compartments. And yet, in every such flight, in every movement of a pilot lying down for a brief rest, echoes of those first nights over the pole can still be felt. Nights when sleep was a reward for endurance and courage. The story goes on without a break, shifting from heroic to everyday, but preserving within itself the same respect for human fragility and resilience. Listening to all of this before sleep, it is easy to feel the words grow softer and your breathing deeper. The story of those who slept in fur masks under the drone of engines does not frighten or agitate. It soothes because it shows that sleep is possible anywhere, even in the most unlikely circumstances, and that makes it something solid and ancient, independent of mattress comfort or room temperature. It is enough to allow yourself to release control, as navigators and pilots once did when they passed the controls to a comrade, knowing they would be woken if anything went wrong. In that trust, in people, in the machine, in the sky itself, lies the main secret of polar sleep. It teaches you not to fear vulnerability. Slowly, the story draws to a close, just as those long Arctic flights did, quietly, unhurriedly, with a sense that a great distance has been covered, even though the listener has never left their place. The airships Norge, Italia, Graf Zeppelin, the aircraft like ANT-25, the hundreds of Soviet polar machines, all of them are now part of history, but their legacy lives on in every modern flight and in every peaceful night's sleep of those who know these stories. Their crews proved that it is possible to sleep in the most impossible conditions if there are comrades nearby, a warm spot by the heater, and at least a few minutes of quiet in the soul. And as you close your eyes now, in an ordinary room under an ordinary blanket, you can picture, high above the world, the invisible shadows of those gondolas and cockpits still drifting by, with someone inside lying down, fastening their straps, and listening to the engines. Let that drone become a lullaby for whoever is listening now, a steady, distant, calming sound that says everything is all right. The course is true, comrades are at their posts, and ahead lies only peace and a long, deep sleep, as fully earned as it was by those who slept in the frozen skies of the Arctic.